Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are beginning chapter 4, which is entitled A Beautiful Collection. The day the Common Council was to decide the fate of the trailer park, Tobin Charney, dressed in a polo shirt, tan slacks, and brown loafers, sat in the middle of a front row bench next to his wife and lawyer. Large pink marble columns stretched up toward a beamed ceiling with an intricate maroon and yellow pattern. A large oak desk rested in the front of the room, facing 15 smaller oak desks assigned to each alderperson and spaced several feet apart. The night before, the lawyer had submitted an addendum to the council. It came in too late for most alders to read, so the lawyer stood and cleared his throat. The addendum, he informed the room, included 10 steps Tobin would take in the immediate and near future. He would enroll in a day-long landlord training class offered by the city, hire a 24-hour security service and an independent management company, evict nuisance tenants, and address the property code violations. He would not retaliate against tenants who spoke out against him, and he would sell the trailer park within a year. Quote, "The people in this park are vulnerable, elderly, disabled, children," end quote, the lawyer concluded, noting that Tobin had, quote, worked diligently, end quote, with Alderman Witowski to, quote, draw up the terms of the agreement, end quote. The Common Council was not happy with this midnight deal, and they argued with one another as sunlight beamed through the chamber's stained glass windows. One alderman called it a, quote, gentleman's agreement, end quote. Another asked if all citizens, when called to account, could simply produce a 10-point plan. Finally, Alderman Witowski rose to speak. Quote, "Mr. Charney has allowed a good mobile home park to move on to something like this," end quote, he began. Quote, "I have 4 mobile home parks in my district, and this is the only one with these type of problems," end quote. He looked over his glasses at the lawyer. Quote, "They aren't all elderly, disabled, and children, sir. But," end quote, he turned back to his colleagues, quote, "there are people with limited means and limited abilities. They will be forced to move out," end quote. Witowski was no friend of Tobin's, but he was unsatisfied with the terms of the Witowski was no friend of Tobin's, but he was satisfied with the terms of the addendum. The debate rose up again, energetic and sharp. Tobin remained seated in the back, holding his wife's hand and looking annoyed. The president called for a vote. After the hearing, Tobin drove to the trailer park. He did not call everyone together to announce the resolution. He did not slide into a chair in the office and let out a sigh. He began evictions. The council had agreed to let Tobin keep his license only if he took drastic steps to improve the park, including forcing the troublemakers out. When city or state officials pressured landlords by ordering them to hire an outside security firm or by having a building inspector scrutinize their property, landlords often passed the pressure on to their tenants. There was also the matter of reestablishing control. The most effective way to assert or reassert ownership of land was to force people from it. Quote, "Where did my 28-day notices go?" end quote, Lenny asked. He was in the office searching through piles of papers. With the 28-day, quote, no cause, end quote, termination notice, landlords did not need to provide a reason for the eviction. It was an ideal way to remove nuisance tenants who were current on their rent. Turning to Tobin, he said, quote, "You got a lot of 28-day notices to fill out," end quote. Quote, "They owe me back rent," end quote, Tobin replied, end quote, "Give them a 5-day, end quote. Quote, "They," end quote, in this case, meant Pam and her family. After driving Pam to eviction court, Tobin had asked her to talk to the news people. She was 30 years old and 7 months pregnant, with a Midwestern twang and a face cut from a high school yearbook photo. She made for a sympathetic case, but now Tobin was cleaning house. Tobin looked up. Quote, "Lenny, I hope the money isn't coming in slow because of this," end quote, he said. Quote, "It's not, surprisingly," end quote, Lenny replied. Quote, "I just filled out my spreadsheets and we're looking good," end quote. Office Susie added, quote, I had a beautiful collection, end quote. Pam tried changing Tobin's mind by signing over the $1,200 check she had just received as part of Obama's Economic Stimulus Act. She thought it would be enough, mainly because she thought she owed $1,800. But Tobin says she owed something more like $3,000, and Office Susie told him Pam smoked crack. Tobin accepted Pam's stimulus check, but moved forward with the eviction anyway. Pam's family had lived in the trailer park for 2 years. Pam and her boyfriend, Ned Crow, ended up in one of Tobin's trailers because he gave it to them. Pam and Ned had been considering moving to Milwaukee from Green Bay to be closer to Pam's ailing father when they spotted an ad Tobin had taken out in the local paper. They drove down to have a look. When Pam and Ned arrived at College Mobile Home Park, Tobin and Lenny offered them the, quote, handyman special, end quote, a free mobile home. Under this arrangement, tenants owned the trailers, and Tobin owned the ground underneath them. He charged the owners, quote, lot rent, end quote, which was equivalent to what his renters paid. But unlike the renters, families who owned their trailers were responsible for upkeep. In theory, a family could at any time move their trailer elsewhere. But the owners knew that in practice, this was impossible. Towing expenses exceed $1,500, and setting up the trailer somewhere else could cost double that. When owners were evicted and inevitably left their trailer behind, Tobin would reclaim it as, quote, abandoned property, end quote, and give it to someone else. At the time that Pam was facing eviction, all but 20 trailers in the park were owner-occupied. The only benefit to owning your trailer was psychological. Quote, I moved here so I can own a home, even if it's on wheels, end quote, one of Pam's neighbors liked to say. Tobin's mobile home giveaway sped things up. He could fill recently vacated trailers, sometimes even junk trailers, in weeks, if not days. But hard-up families found the trailer park on their own, too. In Milwaukee and cities across the country, as affordable rent stock has been allowed to deteriorate and eventually disappear, low-income families have rushed to occupy cheap units. Nationwide, vacancy rates for low-cost units have fallen to single digits. Lenny's office phone rang daily with people inquiring about availability. The phone rang before the news people came, and it rang after they left. The month the story aired, the trailer park had 0 vacancies. Quote, the park is filled up, end quote, Lenny said with a chuckle, end quote, and we still got people calling, end quote. Supposed to be quote, then end quote. I said end quote twice, my fault. The rent rolls that Lenny kept for Tobin showed that in an average month, only 5 trailers sat vacant, which will put Tobin's vacancy rate below 4%. The high demand for the cheapest housing told landlords that for every family in the unit, there were scores behind them ready to take their place. In such an environment, the incentive to lower the rent, forgive a late payment, or spruce up your property was extremely low. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this passage, so let's have a reflection. So, reading this reminded me of the experience that the experiences of people in both the book High Risers and in the book The Color of Law, and not necessarily the experience of the tenants or the people trying to occupy the housing or move into the housing, but the people who were trying to create the housing. One of the roadblocks for people who wanted to create integrated housing in The Color of Law a lot of times would be city councils and city council boards or county boards and politicians. And the same thing existed for public housing when we read about I was referring to public housing as well when I was talking about integrated housing. But one of the other pieces of this puzzle is understanding the role that politicians play in either allowing access to housing for people or limiting access to housing for people. And what we're reading about here in this chapter, where they were considering destroying this trailer park where these mobile homes were at, is very similar to what we read about in High Risers when it was the different times where they tried to, or they conversed about tearing Cabrini Green down. And eventually that book would end with them tearing Cabrini Green down and it being something that passed in the city council and something that the politicians were on board with. And it always it what is illustrated to me as well is that it's not just as simple sometimes as this housing is not good enough or this housing is substandard and so it should be torn down because people shouldn't be having to live in this type of conditions. It's also the fact that some people have made this place their home, and far too often when where houses are torn down or the area, whether it's public housing or trailer parks, these people are not who live there are not given equal resources or equal avenues or viable avenues to get housing in other places. They fall through the cracks, and I think that is something that is a component that we have to make sure that we are attaching as well to these stories. It's not just simply that people don't have access to housing. It's not simply that people have access to housing that is not that's substandard. It's also that there are people who, whether it be for a new store to get put up or for a movie theater to get put up or for different housing to get put up, there are people who are still constantly being removed from their housing forcibly or not by choice, coercively. And again, we see the role that the police department plays in maintaining this status quo and perpetuating and maintaining this system. Okay, let's get back to reading. Quote, figures, end quote. Ned had mumbled past the dangling cigarette when he found out Pam was pregnant with another daughter. He made a son once, when he was 16, with the Mexican girl he met at a ZZ Top concert. But the girl's family blotted him out, and Ned hardly thought about that boy anymore unless, quote, LaGrange came on the radio. Quote, after that, maybe I got punished, end quote, he once mused. Quote, no more boys, end quote. The new one would make 5 daughters if you counted Pam's 2 black girls, which Ned sometimes did. Pam and Ned had met in Green Bay after Pam's father asked Ned to tune up his Harley. Ned was 10 years older than Pam, with grease under his fingernails, brown stubble, and long hair, balding in the front. He was the kind of man who took satisfaction in leaving the bathroom door open and scratching himself in public. Pam already had 2 daughters, Bliss, born when Pam was 23, and Sandra, 2 years after that. Their father, a black man, was a drug dealer whom Pam had met when she was 19. Pam later learned that she was one of several girlfriends. Quote, tell about that time that Dad hit you with a bottle and blood was coming out of your head, end quote, Sandra once asked her mother as they drove to a food pantry. She was 6 when she said this. Pam forced a sad smile. Quote, you weren't old enough to remember that, end quote. Quote, yes, I was, end quote, replied Sandra. Sandra was the one who would squash a cockroach with a loose shoe while the other girls shuddered and clung to one another. She and Bliss were the only black children in the trailer park. Once, one of their neighbors hung a Nazi flag in his front window. Lenny didn't permit that, but he was okay with the Confederate flag as long as it was displayed underneath Old Glory. Quote, no, you were just a baby. Now, Bliss, she got used to it. She always saw blood just pour out of me, end quote. Pam found a way to leave him. She began working as a certified nursing assistant, emptying bedpans, mopping up puke, and rotating the invalids to prevent bed sores. She learned how to cook pots of spaghetti and macaroni salad. Her mother had died in a car accident when Pam was in high school and had never gotten around to teaching her. Her father hadn't either. He spent a lot of time in prison and on drug and drunk driving charges. He spent a lot of time in prison on drug and drunk driving charges. Pam's brother was doing better too. He was taking methadone and said he didn't miss heroin. It was a time of promise and rebirth, a time of putting one foot steadily in front of the other. Then the ground shifted beneath. One day Pam answered the phone. A voice was saying that her brother was dead. Pam asked how. The voice said overdose. He was 29. Pam screamed into the phone. Then she hung up and dialed another number to ask for something to keep her from drowning. The words to describe the drug, quote, crack, end quote, rock, end quote, gave off the impression that it was a gnarled, craggy thing. But when you held it in your hand, it could be smooth and elegant. It could look like a piece of chiclets gum, the kind that slides into a child's cupped hand out of the quarter turn machine. All those years with the drug dealer, Pam had stayed away from it. She saw how it turned people, saw what they would do for it, but she also saw the way it helped people forget. Quote, there was not a day that went by that I wasn't fucked up on something, end quote, Pam remembered. Quote, and sometimes I'd be like, wow, I haven't even cried for him yet. But I didn't. Before I would, I go and get high, end quote. That's when she met Ned. That first year, crack was the force that held them together. They lived for it and by it, raising the girls along the way. Soon they began selling it. A year after meeting, they were caught and convicted. Ned, who had a previous drug charge, did prison time. It was Pam's first felony. She was sentenced to 4 years as probation and made to sit for 10 months in a jail cell, where, finally, she cried. When Pam got out, she tried to stay sober. She moved in with the straightest friend she knew in Green Bay, but while Pam was in, She moved in with the straightest friend she knew in Green Bay, but while Pam was in jail, the friend had developed a habit. Quote, everybody I know in fucking Green Bay is on dope, end quote, Pam vented. She asked her father to wire her $500 so she could move, and, to her surprise, he did. But Green Bay was a small town, and Pam soon crossed paths with one of her former dealers. Quote, he got me hooked right back on, end quote. Pam and Ned reconnected after he was released, and Pam soon discovered she was pregnant. Ned demanded a paternity test, which confirmed the baby was his. They settled on a name, Kristen. Soon, Ned's daughter from another woman came to live with them. Laura had a small nose and freckles and was 1 year older than Bliss. A few months after Laura moved in, Ned left her, Pam and the other girls, with the woman they had just met in the drug scene. Pam and the girls spent the night at the woman's house, then the next night, and the night after that. Pam eventually walked Laura to her mother's house and knocked on the door. She remembers standing at the door and telling Laura's mother, quote, I'm about to have this baby. I'm homeless right now. Your old man left me. I have no money, no food, no nothing for your kid. I'm scared. Can you please take your daughter? End quote. Laura's mother stayed on the phone, gave them a bag of canned food, and shut the door. Pam and the girls stayed at the woman's house. Ned came back a month later. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. So let's have a small reflection. So we, again, are reminded of the racial divide that exists even within poverty. And not even, yes, even within poverty, but sometimes poverty exacerbates that racial divide. And so one of the first things that stands out to me is how Ned spoke about sometimes he counted the black girls, the black daughters that Pam had, and sometimes he didn't. And I'm guessing the reason that he would count them sometimes and not other times is because they were black. I think that, and then to think about the experience that these black girls had of having to live in this trailer park, which was majority of white people, and not just any white people, but racist white people, and having to see Nazi flags go up, and then maybe that was taken down, but it was only replaced with a Confederate flag, which has a lot of the same symbolism that the Nazi flag has. And so just imagining what that experience is like for those young black girls. And then what also stands out in here as well is seeing how traumas can exasperate and even sometimes create addiction issues. When people try to self-medicate, sometimes people self-medicate for physical issues and physical pain. Other times people self-medicate for psychological or emotional issues, emotional or psychological distress. And we see that was one of the things that Pam did. Also, the specter of of addiction and how difficult it is to escape it when it's something that may have infiltrated, all friend groups you have or all family groups you have. Sometimes I think that we discount how deep addiction can go into communities. And so we see here how difficult it was for Pam to try to shake this addiction. The first father of her first children was somebody who was selling drugs and abusing her. Father of her next children was somebody who was also addicted to drugs. And we see that she wasn't really given assistance. That's the thing about prison and jail and probation. These things are considered punishments, but these things are not. These things do not provide people the tools and the utilities to be able uh, to struggle against these demons that they have when it comes to addiction. And then combine that with the overall theme of the book, which is the concept of housing and how issues of addiction can lead to exasperate having issues of finding housing or issues of keeping stable housing. Okay, I think we got like one more passage left before we finish up this chapter, and then we'll wrap the episode up. So let's keep reading. When Tobin told Pam and Ned he was keeping their rebate check and still evicting them, he brought along a security detail. But nobody caused a scene, even though Tobin only gave them 24 hours to leave before he called the sheriff. Ned might have raised hell if he didn't have an outstanding warrant for his arrest, stemming from another drug charge. Pam and Ned blamed each other for the eviction. Quote, "You cracked it up," end quote, Ned snapped at Pam. Quote, "You cracked it up," end quote, Pam shot back. Quote, "Talking about me, I handed you all the money. You got us evicted," end quote. Quote, "Move, bitch," end quote. Quote, "It's you, Ned," end quote. Quote, "You can move," end quote. Quote, "I can't. It's you," end quote. Pam stopped. Quote, "I don't know. Is it really me? Is it me who has the problem? I don't know. Maybe it is. Am I the one that fucked up?" End quote. They sold their only possessions worth anything, the television and the computer, Pam's Christmas gift. They would need the extra cash. Each month, Pam worked 30 hours a week for her welfare check of $673 and received $390 in food stamps. On a good day, Ned brought in $50 cash for customizing and repairing motorcycles. Pam's money was Pam's money, and Ned's was Ned's. They kept separate bank accounts and split the bills down the middle. After jail, Pam had had a difficult time finding work with her recent drug conviction. She finally was hired by Quad Graphics, a commercial printing plant. Quad had a reputation for hiring people with records and without high school diplomas, provided they were willing to work the third shift. Pam was. She ran the warm, humming machines from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Quad Graphics was in Sussex, a 40-minute drive from the trailer park. Pam relished the commute. It was her time away from Ned and the kids. Then her car gave out at the worst time, winter, when money was the tightest. Ned had been working with the construction crew, which all but shut down in the colder months. They didn't have enough money to repair the car, and Pam lost her job. That's when they fell behind with Tobin. Emergency assistance got them through 1 month. A couple months later, in February, Pam gave Tobin $1,000 that she received from her tax refund. But they were still in the red. Pam could have given Tobin more, but she wanted to get back to Quad, which meant she needed a car. She bought one for $400, but a week later, Ned heard a clicking sound and told Pam to offload it before the engine threw a rod. And a lot of money went to dope. There were mornings when Pam would come home. From working the third shift to find Ned at Heroin Susie's or wide awake in the living room on the tail end of an all-night bender with women passed out on the couch. There were evenings when Pam got so high she couldn't walk. The computer and television sold, the rest of their things shoved into garbage bags. Pam walked across the row and asked Scott if she and her family could stay with him until they got back on their feet, or at least until the baby came. Scott was a heroin user approaching 40. He lived with Teddy, an older man he had met when both were staying at the lodge. Pam trusted them around the girls, even if Scott did pass out in front of them once. Scott and Teddy said yes and didn't even ask for money. Tobin huffed when Officer Susie told him that Pam and Ned were staying with Scott and Teddy. He had agreed to rent Scott and Teddy's trailer to Scott and Teddy, nobody else. Tobin gave Scott and Teddy an eviction notice, tacking on Pam and Ned's rental debt to Scott and Teddy's bill. Eviction could be contagious that way. Oh, that's some sick ass shit. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. And what stands out to me at the end of that chapter is definitely the way that the landlord handled the Pam and Ned moving into someone else's trailer park, someone else's trailer or mobile home, excuse me. And it's very disgusting. I think that one of the things that has been painted is that as much as I have understanding for these people who are landlords and the fact that they are also, working a job, the way that they treat these people and human beings is disgusting. And that is what happens with capitalism, is that since everything is about the bottom line, everything is about the dollar, that people are expendable. People become more vulnerable. The people who have less money become more vulnerable. And of course, there is a lot of ways to look at Pam in that situation. There will be somebody who only blames them for their situation and blames them for, smoking, doing drugs, and the drugs leading to them not being able to pay bills. But I think that one of the things that has to be pointed out is that addiction is a health issue and it has to be treated as such. It can't be treated as anything else, because there is no empirical evidence that treating it as something else, treating it as a crime issue, solves it or helps it at all. And so it has to be treated as a health issue. And so these people who are having a health issue, a health crisis, and once they've already been taken, they've already been evicted, they're already out of their home. And so they went to someone else to try to get help, to try to get someone else to give them assistance, to try to get them back on their feet. And instead of Tobin, the man who owns the trailer homes and owns this plot of land, being understanding of the fact that this is the situation, he just was looking for understanding when he was at the city council, and he wanted understanding then, but he doesn't want to extend that understanding out now to this couple with children who he's kicked out and evicted. And I don't know, it's just a very vicious cycle of capitalism and lack of empathy. And so we're going to end this episode here. We will be back tomorrow to continue reading Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holla at you tomorrow.